everybody has the packet, right? Okay, so we've got, we're on page 13, and we've got 3 poems in the packet left to do. And then I brought in one bonus poem that I told you about from a poet who has a book that just came out that I'd encourage you actually to buy, because I just read through the whole book and it's fantastic. But I'll give this one out then at the end. So we'll try to spend about 15 minutes on each of these. And as I told you on the first week, we're moving from, I think, greater to lesser attachment to faith. But what we saw in the first 3 weeks was that everybody that I brought in, and I think most poets who write in any sort of interesting way about faith or theology or religious belief, have some level of conflict, some deeper thoughts about it, some worries, concerns, moments of doubt, and moments of greater faith. And those kinds of conflicts are very interesting to me. It's hard for me to say, I think as it is for many of us when we read things, it's hard for me to say if I gravitate towards those poems because that's a topic that I'm interested in or kind of feeling that I'm interested in, or if it actually is true that more poets are writing like that. So I don't know for sure, but it's hard for me even to find poems where I don't see some little cracks in that faith. And I know that that's sort of an interesting thing for me to study, but as we've been moving along, the poems I brought in today are ones that I would say seem to weigh more heavily on the side of doubt than of belief. And yet, even within the poems that I think are very doubting, we find moments of belief. So I don't know that I could find anything that's starkly or entirely one side or the other. All of them seem to bring in some kind of mixture. So that's how I approach these poems. You may disagree with that reading, but I want to look at these 3 and see them in this framework of sort of expressing a kind of doubt, but also suggesting that there's more to that doubt than just non-belief. So the poet that we're going to look at first, I brought in 2 sonnets, and it's very hard for me to choose. This is Mark Jarman on page 13. He wrote a series of poems that I mentioned to you that play off of Donne. Remember John Donne's, his early holy sonnets, and these are called the unholy sonnets. Well, when someone sets right up that they're writing unholy sonnets, obviously you're put into a place where you think, okay, Donne was very, very faithful, even if we saw little moments where he expressed some skepticism, and he wrote a series called Holy Sonnets, and so here this must just be the opposite. But I actually think we'll see that it's much more complicated than just the opposite. I'd encourage you also to look up the Holy Sonnets. I think 4 or 5 of them are on the Poetry Foundation website. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's run by the same organization that does Poetry Magazine, so it's a great resource. Biographies, links to poems that have been published in Poetry Magazine, but also other ones. So if you want to see more of these, they're quite different from each other. Some of them are lyric poems, some are narrative poems, some of them follow perfect sonnet form, and some of them are a little bit more like messing around with the sonnet form. So you can look those up if you want. But I chose 2 that I thought maybe fit into this framework that I'm talking about. Well, I think all of them do. He's a contemporary poet. He is, yes. So these were written, he wrote the first series of them, and then he published some additional ones, and then I think he's had some more come out since then. So he teaches at, I believe, Emory University. So, he's in Georgia. I'm pretty sure it's Emory. And he's probably in his 50s. Yeah, he's still writing. And he has, and some of these unholy sonnets appeared in a collection called Questions for Ecclesiastes. And so you see that he's already often thinking about religious questions. He also has a series of contemporary psalms that he's written. So this is a poet who's often thinking about religious questions.
He came from a religious background. His father was a minister.
That's exactly right, yes.
So brought up with theology.
Certainly, yes. And so we can talk a little bit more about him if you want to. Although, as you know, I don't like to do too much bio because I want to see what the poem says. But yeah, we can see even just from his body of work how much he's thinking about religious questions. I love the idea of Questions for Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes is already work that has so many questions in it. And to ask questions of Ecclesiastes, it's even more. So let's look at Unholy Sonnet 11, and then we'll go on to Unholy Sonnet 1, which I think is a little bit harder. Okay. Half asleep in prayer, I said the right thing and felt a sudden pleasure come into the room or my own body. In the dark, charged with a change of atmosphere. At first, I couldn't tell my body from the room, and I was wide awake, full of this feeling, alert as though I'd heard a doorknob twist, a drawer pulled, and instead of terror, knew the intrusion of an overwhelming joy. I had said thanks, and this was the response. But how I said it, or what I said it for, I still cannot recall, and I have tried all sorts of ways, all hours of the night. Once was enough to be dissatisfied. Nobody laughed at the end, so I feel like maybe we missed it. Let's talk through this one. This is narrative, right? He's just telling us a sort of short little story about something that happened to him. What is the thing that happened to him?
He had an out-of-body experience.
Okay. Why?
I said to Hillary earlier, I think many people have had out-of-body experiences, and you don't know what triggers them, but it occurs.
Do we have any sense from the poem itself what triggered it?
He says he's praying.
That's right, prayer. Yeah, prayer. So, but he was half asleep. You know that feeling, right? Not the feeling of being half asleep. I think we all know that one. But if half asleep in prayer,
It's the most
come to
obvious
Shach Read here
experience.
sometime. You'll see people feel this. It's the
Mota'ani
the Mota'ani experience, or possibly the whoops, I forgot to say Shema experience at night, right? Because this is like the sort of nighttime. He's like lying in bed, half asleep, and he says a prayer, and suddenly he's wide awake because he feels this amazing feeling. So you could describe it as an out-of-body experience.
Or
We get that from
inspiration or fullness of spirit.
right. He calls it overwhelming joy, right? Which is sort of a lovely, straightforward, not particularly image-rich phrase, just to feel overwhelming joy. The out-of-body experience, we get a little bit from the line that says, I couldn't tell my body from the room, right? There's this sort of sense of unity, one with the world, right? He has that. And it's this sort of amazing thing that he experiences. What's the image in the middle when he says, alert as though I'd heard a doorknob twist, a drawer pull, and instead of terror knew the intrusion of an overwhelming joy?
There were sounds. There must have been some sounds, whether we were thinking of the rustle of leaves here.
Okay.
But there's something, and it startled him.
Oh, I'm not sure. It's as if someone's in the room, but I'm not sure it's literal. I think when he says alert as though, you know that you're almost falling asleep and then you hear a noise and you think, is someone in my house? But it's not because he actually heard a noise. He's just alert as though he had heard a noise. That's what the simile is. Not a literal noise.
Okay.
Yeah, but as alert as if he'd heard a noise, right? It like jolts you awake, right? So you're half asleep and you're jolted awake. When that happens to us, often it's because we hear a noise. Here he's saying no, it was because of this prayer. We're on page 13. It was because of this feeling that accompanied this half asleep prayer. And I think there's just something very clever about the language there, because you know that the doorknob twist, the drawer pulled, right? Instead of terror, which is what you would feel if you heard a doorknob twist and a drawer pulled when you think you're home alone, knew the intrusion of an overwhelming joy. And I love the word intrusion there, because of course what we think is there's an intruder, right? But who's the intruder? Well, it's not said, but it's implied because it was in prayer, and it led to this overwhelming joy that the intruder is God, right? There's this intruder, there's an intrusion into his world. And then this great one sentence, one line, right? No enjambment, on to the next line. I had said thanks, and this was the response. Okay? And then we have a little bit of a change in the last four lines. But how I had said it, or what I had said, or what I had said it for, I still cannot recall. Right? So he was half asleep in prayer, so he doesn't quite remember what the prayer was. And I've tried all sorts of ways, all hours of the night. And then, of course, the whole poem comes to a head in that last line. Once was enough to be dissatisfied. Now, you might think, forget that it's called an unholy sonnet for a minute. You might think, once was enough to be satisfied. Right?
He's referring to his thinking process. It was a moment of overwhelming joy, and he can't recall it. He can't recreate
get it
it.
back. That's right.
So, and it was aggravating enough the first time that he couldn't recall it. So once was enough to be dissatisfied. You got to smile at me, you do.
Yeah. But also, there is a sense of the truth and efficacy of prayer because he experienced it once. Had he never experienced it at all, we're not sure he would be dissatisfied either, right? You have to have had it happen once, because then what are you trying to do? Constantly reclaim that feeling, and you can't. But you know that it existed, and that means that it could exist again. So why do you think he calls this an unholy sonnet? It's a poem all about prayer. It's about prayer working in some way, at least for him. I mean, he said, he didn't say, I asked for something and it was rewarded. He said, I said thanks and I got this feeling in response. So why is it unholy?
Because he couldn't accept it, I think.
Couldn't accept what? What's the it?
That it was fleeting and it didn't come again.
Right. Okay, so there's a frustration in that, and the frustration, giving into that feeling of frustration or that sense of dissatisfaction is an unholiness. Do you all agree with that? What do you think?
I don't think so.
You want to say something?
I just I don't agree. I think I'm not sure why it's called an unholy sonnet. I think the dissatisfaction, the reason we need to be satisfied is it's to not have need anymore. It's to sort of like not, part of fulfillment is its incompletion. Meaning not to have everything that you ever would want would be a terrible thing.
Ah, interesting. So actually what he's saying here is that dissatisfaction is a positive thing. At the very least, it keeps him praying, right? Because he's trying to regain that feeling.
And it makes, and then this will come into the next one too, a sense that there has to be something that's kind of beyond.
Right. Good. Okay. So that you just think unholy sonnet is a misnomer.
But it could be
I
unholy.
don't know what it's called.
Why you called it that? Okay, fine.
I would say unholy because obviously God or the God figure is not accessible. It just happenstance. It just happened by chance once.
Right. Do you see it as maybe related, because you said the word happenstance, to the Thomas Hardy poem we read last time, Hap, where it was like, I happen to have been sort of graced with pain instead of pleasure, but it could have easily been the other way. Something here that also feels similarly random, except that it was a good feeling.
And
It's a lot less negative, the overall tone.
Right, but the
Yeah.
people you pray, you're answered. This didn't happen.
Right. He doesn't even know what he said.
He didn't. Right. He didn't even know what he said.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Well, I think it implies that there is still doubt. The dissatisfaction is probably
Interesting.
doubt that
Interesting.
it feels in not having a total resolution of what this is and consistency.
Right.
It's answered.
Interesting. On the other hand, if you could call up that feeling anytime you wanted, I don't know, then the effort to pray probably wouldn't feel so meaningful, right? Because you know that it's easily accessible to you at any moment. The struggle for it here is part of the value. Right? Did you want to say something?
I sort of wanted to say that it does touch on God and God's response to prayer.
Yes.
But it's not a holy sonnet in a way that it's not just exalting God.
That's right.
It's not so serious about how wonderful,
Excellent.
That's what.
Right. But do you see then how unholiness doesn't really mean the opposite of
Right.
holiness, but
Exactly.
something else? Yeah. I think that that's what he does over and over again with that word unholy. It means raising questions, positing challenges, but not the perfect opposite of holiness, right? And it's sort of an interesting way. I'm in the process of publishing an article about Mark Jarman, which I'm happy to send you a link to when it's finally out. I've been working on it for about a year. And I looked up the history of the word unholy to see, and it's been used in a bunch of different ways in like Christian religious texts. And sometimes it really means like, if you're a sinner, you're unholy, but other times it has this more nuanced kind of, if you ever question, there's a kind of sense of unholiness too. So maybe that he's playing around with
Right,
historical
we're
use of the
playing
term.
around.
Yeah. I think you were next. Yeah.
I wondered whether, here he is, half asleep, and so he said, oh, I've got to say my prayers, and he just says them,
Yeah.
and something happens.
Yeah.
And maybe he's dissatisfied because religion or saying prayers was pro forma.
It does feel like it's by rote in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, but maybe it's not pro forma. Maybe there really is something to religion.
Oh, sure. That I think is definitely implied in the poem, or it wouldn't have happened once.
Right.
Right? He feels like this feeling that he had was real,
He's
and he wants to recapture it. Yes, but it may also be something frustrating about the fact that it happened when he was least paying attention to it, as opposed to all the times that we put kavanah into prayer and we don't have that feeling, right? And so there's a frustration in that too, which means that when you're making an effort to recapture it, that's like dafka when you can't recapture it. Yeah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say he doesn't mention God.
He doesn't.
He doesn't mention that he felt the presence of God. It was sort of...
It's implied, yeah.
You think so?
I do think so. I think instead I felt that overwhelming joy, the intrusion of an overwhelming joy, and that idea of it being like intrusion, it's like a separate entity that sort of entered him. Yeah. I may be reading God into that though. I'm putting those things together, saying, well, prayer, overwhelming joy, he must be saying it's
A
God.
sudden pleasure.
Maybe not. The sudden
That's bigger than
pleasure.
his body, it might be
If
the
you
room.
weren't religious in reading it, what would you say?
I can't answer that question. I mean, I can't be other than I am, but we can try to imagine. But I think also because it starts with prayer, he's setting it for us in a religious context, whether the reader is religious or not. He doesn't say, I was just lying in bed thinking about television, and right, it's half asleep in prayer. So it's putting us into a religious context, whether we are religious readers or not. Otherwise, why prayer? Right.
Well, I mean, looking at it, it could also have been a sexual experience. In a
Why
strange-
prayer then?
I don't know. I don't know what that can open you up to. There.
Oh, you mean because of sudden pleasure and some of that language? There's definitely something bodily here, right? Sudden pleasure coming to the room in my own body. I see
that was
that,
another
but
side of this, but I do believe this was a true religious experience.
yes.
But
Non-religious people pray as well. If there are dangers, oh God, help me.
There are no
Okay, that's the
atheists
atheist and foxholes thing, right? Sure. But then you wouldn't say that that's a fully non-religious experience, right? If they're doing that, oh God, help me. There's a moment of turning to religion, right?
He doesn't say it's a religious experience.
No, he just uses the word prayer, which I interpret as a religious experience. But even the way you said non-religious people pray, if you're saying they're saying, oh God, help me, I would call that a religious experience, whether the person would say that he or she is a religious person or not. A non-religious person can have a religious moment. Otherwise, why are they saying, oh God, help me?
We go to, I mean, everybody does that, right?
I don't think that's necessarily true. No, I think people who are really avowed atheists actually wouldn't.
Let's bring it to another dimension. Let's say Jews that were being killed,
Uh-huh.
being Jewish, even the ones who were totally assimilated.
Yes,
Call that
sure. But assimilated and non-religious are not the same thing. Look, if you're asking me, I would say those are not necessarily the same thing, right? There can be a deep buried kernel of faith that doesn't manifest itself in halakha, but it doesn't mean that a person's not religious. I try to distinguish also between observance and religion. I don't think that those are necessarily perfectly overlapping. I think they're often not, actually.
That's religiosity.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
Another comment on this one, and then I think we'll move on. Yeah.
The only thing I was thinking was, going back to the question of unholy, is that pretty much every poem that you've given us, sonnets and otherwise, including Dunn's, could be described as unholy.
Yeah, true. I sort of said that right before you walked in, that like that's been a theme.
But also, this idea. I mean, I agree that you can be a non-believer and yet have moments of transcendence or whatever that would be considered, I guess in some larger sense,
Religious experience, right?
One thing I find interesting here is that we have a concept of you do, and then
That's
you
right.
understand.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
here he's sort of, he's been saying thanks.
Right.
Like, by rote or by
Pro forma, right? Mhm.
Consciously or semi-consciously, as you imply, and then he's given the gift.
Yes.
First the thanks, then suddenly, what I'm thankful for.
Right.
And that seems to me to be sort of the key here.
Yeah. It's a lovely way to think about prayer, I think, and also I think reflects some of the frustration of prayer that probably all of us feel at one time or another. right? That there is a frustration in prayer. Did you want to make one last comment on that?
Well, I was just going to, thinking about unholy, it's almost in a sense as if he's a little ungrateful and disappointed.
Yeah, it is. Right, instead of being grateful for that one experience,
Right,
it's like, give me more.
We don't often have a spiritual experience at that level.
Yes.
And so, a little ungrateful, maybe.
Right.
Wanting more
Right.
the same.
I don't know if I go so far as to call that unholy. Maybe that's not the word I would choose, but there is a sense of, I'm glad you gave me that. It's not enough. Right? Which isn't necessarily,
How
if
can I
you
get
think
it
about
again?
how can I get
What
it
are the
again?
magic words?
Right, exactly. I mean, you think about that as a sort of parenting metaphor, which often people use for the relationship with God, right? That you've given your child something that they want, and instead of being enormously grateful for it, they say, give me another one, right? So,
Coming from God, you want to be grateful.
Right, exactly. But he's saying still dissatisfied. Let's look at the next one. This is Unholy Sonnet 1. He renumbered them in different places because they're published in different collections. But this one I think feels a little bit more irreverent off the bat, and then we'll sort of see what we want to make of it. Dear God, our Heavenly Father, gracious Lord, Mother Love and Maker, Light Divine, Atomic Fingertip, Cosmic Design, first letter of the alphabet, last word, mutual satisfaction, cash award, auditor who approves our bottom line, examiner who says that we are fine, oasis that all sands are running toward. I can say almost anything about you, oh big idea, and with each epithet create new reasons to believe or doubt you. Black hole, white hole, presidential jet. But what's the anything I must leave out? You solve nothing but the problems that I set. It's really hard at the end. I think that I puzzled over this line a long time. It's hard, but the beginning is just this list of terms, some that feel, I think, traditionally pious, some that feel quite irreverent. Cash award, what is that?
It has a flow to it because
does.
God became, mammon. Money became God.
Good,
so
yeah.
there's this flow to it from God traditionally to God, mother love. All of a sudden we're into, then if it's not God, it's something. It's atomic. It's a big. So he really does move through theories about what is this entity that we all see.
Right, and even the last one there, oasis that all sands are running towards. Sort of like, the God who oversees death, where he seems to almost be invoking done, more literally, death be not proud, right? And then the break, we have a clear sense of what kind of sonnet style we're working with here, because he even puts the break in there for us and says, I can say almost anything about you, oh big idea, and with each epithet create new reasons to believe or doubt you. Which I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but I think it's a sort of lovely sentiment that the container of language, we talked about this a little bit before, but the container of language is limited, and it shapes how we try to envision something that is beyond language, right? That's an idea that Jarman plays around with a lot in his poems, is how insufficient language is to express an idea that is God. Right? And so here we see that maybe dear God or our Heavenly Father or gracious Lord, those are big, vague ideas that may bring us somewhat towards encompassing idea of God. But each of those other things is limiting in various ways, and it's because of our own limitations that we end up creating for ourselves new reasons to believe or doubt, right? It's not saying that God has given us reasons to believe or doubt, but we, with our own language, do that. Yes?
Well, I think in addition to the limitations, I think what you have here is probably a trajectory going from the traditional,
Yeah.
as was pointed out, to the modern, postmodern. And the options of freedom of interpretation that our modern world allows for, that it could be something as spiritually uplifting or as banal as a cash machine.
That's right.
And that's, I think that's really a reflection of modern times today.
Right.
That we use very flippantly.
That's
Oh
right.
my God,
That's right. Absolutely.
I won a lottery.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this is
Right.
a beautiful sunset.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
Right.
I'm touched spiritually.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's the limitations. I think it may be the excess.
Nice.
The excess of modern modern times that
Interesting.
gives us
Right.
this very vast
Right.
landscape of terminology
That's great.
that we can use just so casually.
And that works really well for things like cash award or presidential jet, which are so modern. I don't think we see a perfect trajectory, though, because they're kind of all over the place, these terms, right? If you saw them devolving from things that felt traditionally pious
Right.
progressively into things that felt less, but actually I think, I don't know, the middle lines to me are the most material. Cash award, auditor who approves our bottom line, whereas oasis that all sands are running towards feels to me something that's like a profounder idea. A
Or
less
he's pulling back.
Right, exactly. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's when, I went too far, now I pull back a little bit. But it's interesting to look at actually the order of these terms because they're not in a perfectly clear trajectory from one pole to another.
I would also add that in more traditional times, it was blasphemous to say God's name in vain.
Right.
Right? I mean, we have that
Sure.
tradition, and so Paul was very careful that he uses
Yes,
God.
that's right.
And here, he actually does invoke God, which was missing in the last poem. But we too, we say, oh my God, we use
Right.
it so generously
Right.
and just with that
Right.
the reverence, so we can
Absolutely.
attach to anything.
Right. He is definitely saying that, but I think even going a step beyond that and saying the way that I use God in my language shapes whether I believe or doubt. Right? So it says, right, I can create new reasons to believe or doubt you. So it's what you're saying even turned up a notch, right? Yeah.
It seems that he thinks that formerly God was referred to as a heavenly Father and a gracious Lord, and now in our current life, he's a big idea.
I don't know. Definitely he says both those things, but I'm not sure where you're seeing formerly and now. Where do you see the time change? Like, is this a nostalgia for a time when we were more respectful of God poem?
My feeling is that traditionally,
Yeah.
God has been referred to as, in all the texts and so on,
Yeah.
as Heavenly Father, gracious Lord.
But people still do say that today.
Yes,
That's not gone
but what
from
he's
our
bringing
language.
in the difference today, he calls God a big idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a totally different reference.
It is. I agree with everything you're saying except for the previously and now part of it. I just don't see that in the poem. I see why people would say that because we also have generally a sense that like people used to be, I don't know, better somehow, right? And now we're all so terrible. But I'm just not sure the poem says that. But certainly he's pointing out that there are multiple ways to conceive of God, whether it's a chronological issue, I don't know, for him, in this poem. Yeah.
I like the way he says, "Dear God," at the beginning.
So it's an address.
Is that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I know, it's really clever.
Right. But then he goes on and he becomes almost snide
Yes,
in
that's
his
right.
way. But then if you get to the next to the last line, but what's the anything I must leave out? You.
Oh, yay, I'm so glad you noticed that. I was going to talk about that.
It's on that line.
Yep.
And then there's a
So
break.
clever. I mean, his play with language I just think is fantastic, but that's a great one. So a lot of times students will ask me, why do poets put the line breaks where they put them? Right? Sometimes it's for rhyme, sometimes it's for rhythm, sometimes we can't quite tell why. But sometimes the line breaks actually change the meaning, and that's one of them. Right? So there's a sentence there. What's the anything I must leave out? You solve nothing but the problems that I set. But if we read it by the line break, what's the anything I must leave out? You. And that is like a kind of self-critique or a social critique, right, of the way that all of these words that we throw at God, sort of what you were saying, leave God out of it, right? Now, we can't not deal with you solve nothing but the problems that I set, which is pretty complicated, but it's great to notice how the line break is put in there too to offer it a secondary meaning. So what do you think you solve nothing but the problems that I set means? It's hard.
It's such a personal thing. It's such a subjective thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there used to be, again, going back to the traditional concept, more unified concept, probably, whether it was understood or not. But now it's become it's self-defined, and that's very modern. That goes back to what I said earlier,
Huh.
is that it could be, oh my God, you know, that
Right,
table
right,
is
right.
broken.
I don't see the modernity in it though. I mean, we can't possibly say that like Abraham or Moshe did not have a personal relationship with God. Right? I mean, that's what we're all aiming for on some level, is the personal relationship that people once had with God, certain people anyway. The way that you're talking about it, that irreverence, or the way that we throw around the language, that feels us like a slightly different thing from whether we have a personal relationship with God or not. But, you know, even Rambam said that there is room in prayer for us to insert personal prayers, and that idea goes way back too. So I don't know that that God was ever a perfectly uniform concept that everybody agreed. Maybe there's more public irreverence now. There's more room for that. But personal relationship, I don't think is brand new. I really don't. And I think we can look to Chazal to see places where it's encouraged.
I would read into it, you know, I always add little words.
Okay.
Okay, but what's the anything I must leave out? You, and I would add, but you solve nothing but the problems that I set. I just added 2 words.
You only added
No.
one.
Yeah, she's repeating you.
I repeated, but I repeated
Oh,
the you.
you. Oh, I
You.
see.
And then he steps back and says, but you solve nothing but the problems that I set.
And what does that mean?
Then the question of God is still bothering him and
Yeah.
still unanswered.
Right.
I don't know whether that's correct or not. I mean, it's pushing.
Okay. Do other people have thoughts on it? Yeah. Did you want to say?
Well, one thing is that God, and it goes back again to the other poem, is more than our needs or even our what we can conceive.
Right.
And you know, I mean, it's interesting to see, well, what's the anything I must leave out? Why must we leave out anything?
Yeah.
Well, it's because ultimately, you know, God, you know, as we can't conceive of Him,
Right.
is something more than what we know or even what we're able to understand.
That's how I read it too. That it really is. That's the reading that I have of those last couple lines is, again, there's a human limitation here, right? And the human limitation is I can put a whole bunch of words together that try to encapsulate what I think God is, but ultimately I'm only even capable of envisioning the problems I have, which means that the God that I can envision is only capable then of solving the problems that I set. It's about human limitation. I think it's very complex. I'm not sure that that's the only reading of those lines, but that is how I see that. Just what it means to say you solve nothing but the problems that I set. I don't think it's saying because God is so limited, but because I am. Right? I can't conceive of bigger problems than my own, and therefore the problems I'm asking God to solve are the problems that I'm capable of articulating. Right? If I'm not big enough to articulate these bigger problems, then I can't ask God to solve them. Do you see that as a possibility at least?
You know, because it
Yeah.
says I say almost anything about you, and what's the anything I must leave out?
That's what the anything refers back to, is that one
so
from that line.
He said
yeah.
big idea,
Right.
but I can't see the big idea. Black hole, people can't always envision what that black hole is or the white hole is.
I also
about
think
the presidential jet.
we throw out I can say as though those are meaningless words, but here I don't think they're meaningless words at all. I think he literally means I can say it's really about language. And also I can say almost anything, right? Not everything, almost anything. And what's the anything I must leave out? That's where the you reading works really well. What did you want to say?
Yeah, to be a devil's advocate.
Yeah, great.
Those words that he chooses.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of cash award,
Mhm.
auditor, presidential? I mean, there's no rhyme or reason for putting these
It
words.
seems
that
like
satire?
it. It seems like
Is that
it.
to sort of wake you up or to
It may be.
jar you?
Yes, and I think there is something jarring about the juxtaposition of genuinely reverent terms that we would actually use in, say, a prayer book, and ones that feel so materialistic and superficial.
Why does he
Why those? I don't know. The one that bothers me the most, honestly, is presidential jet. I just don't even know what to make of that. Cash award I see because, like this idea of people worshiping money, I think is, that one makes more sense to me. An auditor who approves our bottom line too, because how much of our self-regard and self-concern is about our finances. So that, at least if I'm thinking about ways that people think about God and things that people ask for,
Although
prosperity,
it can have
that
a
makes
double meaning.
sense.
Certainly in Judaism it does, because
Right, what's our bottom
we're
line?
judged and,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you say auditor, of course you're already thinking money, but auditor who approves our bottom line could certainly be metaphorical.
It can be Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur.
Exactly. But presidential jet, I just don't know what to make of that one. I don't know if that's saying that we worship authorities on earth, right? And then that's something about president. But the jet, I don't know. I gotta say, I'm leaving you with a question on that one because I do not know the answer.
What about the last line in the first paragraph?
Oasis that all sands are running towards.
Sands, why would
So that to me is-
sands be running? It's more like water should be running towards the oasis.
Well, not necessarily. The oasis already has the water. The sand is all going. I think also the sands, whenever you picture sands running, automatically I think the poetic image that comes to mind is the hourglass.
Yes.
Right? Did you just say hourglass?
Yes,
Okay, yeah.
hourglass.
So I think you're supposed to see like that your time is running out towards this end.
But it also has an infinity concept within
For
it.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the sand.
Yeah.
Is he also saying, in the last line, you solve for the world nothing but the problems I set?
That's a good question, right? Is it that you can, for me, you can only solve the problems I set, or for everyone you can solve only problems I set, which elevates the I here to a pretty high level, right? You can solve the world's problems that I set. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's suggesting at least that our conception, whether it's communal or individual, is limited, right? And because our own understanding of God's power is limited by our humanity, then our understanding of what God can solve is limited by our humanity. And that's my extremely religious reading of this one, right? But I think it's funny to see what could be such a pious sort of recognition of God's power in a poem that feels like it's so irreverent on the surface. That's one of the things I really like about what he does.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, and that it's the conflict between, am I really deeply religious, or is this really just the presidential jet,
Right.
taking me,
That's
there's
a real
humor or a
question.
sarcasm or a sardonic
Yes.
tone
Great,
here.
yeah.
He starts out religiously, but then he's, what am I doing?
But then I think it ends religiously too.
It does.
Yeah.
Once we know that he's a minister's son,
Right.
this is almost like the ongoing argument of a kid and his father about,
Nice.
can I be irreverent about what you're saying?
Yeah.
Do I believe in what
But
you're
the
saying,
respect
or
is
do
still
I
there.
really
Yeah.
believe in what you're saying?
Right.
So it's almost like the arguments he could or
Right.
couldn't have as a kid.
Right.
Or
Also,
as an
I'd say,
adult.
as an adult, he's a churchgoer. He's a like.
He may not have been
I'm like
free
so
to doubt
hesitant to
that
say
also.
like he's a religious person. I hate that language. But he's a person who talks about himself as a religious person, who is like a regular church attendee who writes a lot about religion. Who's widely considered to be like a contemporary Christian poet. So once we read it in that light, I think then we can find more of that sort of piety in here. But I think he's also totally open to us finding the humor in it and the sarcasm and the questioning and all of those things too. I don't think being religious precludes those kinds of readings. Yeah.
Going back to your interpretation about the limitations of language.
Yes.
This seems to be very self-reflective, he being
Yeah.
a poet.
Right, exactly.
And
That's right.
What are, he's obviously grappling with, in a way he's playing with us, because he's throwing
That's
in
right.
all of
Yeah.
these different words, cognitive design
Yeah.
and this and that, and a lot of it is very, very, banal and everyday. But, again, following your idea that, what's the anything I must leave out? I don't know, that sort of questioning.
Yeah.
And, again, it's just interesting that a poet whose
Right.
craft
His
and
words.
talent
Right.
is language
Right.
is looking at himself and perhaps again that ability that he has
Yeah.
to reflect
Right.
on
That's right.
very deep issues he finds wanting.
Yes. Don't you prefer that though? I like a poet with a little modesty.
Sorry?
I like a poet with a little modesty. Right? Like, I think it,
Yeah.
and we see that in lots of writing, right? The writer who says, I just don't have all the right words. So if anything, I hope that you'll go look up some more Mark German, because it's not as like famous as he should be, I think.
Go back to the first poem,
Yeah.
I said thanks, and this was the response.
Right.
So I said words, and I got this overwhelming thing, and I
Yeah.
can't even remember what
What
the
the
words
words
were.
were,
So it's
yeah,
back to
great.
the language thing.
Just to make sure we can get to the last two, though, let's keep going, even though there's still more we could say about Jarman. This next poem is also a narrative poem. I will frame it very slightly for you because I think it helps. This is written immediately post 9/11.
That's just
Yeah.
what I thought.
And it was published in the New Yorker, October of 2011. October of 2001. So, so I think you have to know, you would pick that up, but it's, that's the
I did.
context.
I picked that up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I saw you walking. I saw you walking through Newark Penn Station in your shoes of white ash. At the corner of my nervous glance, your dazed passage first forced me away, tracing the crescent birth you'd give a drunk, a lurcher, nuzzling all comers with ill will and his stench. But not this one, not today. One shirt arm's sheared clean from the shoulder, the whole bare limb wet with muscle and shining dimly pink, the other full sheathed in cotton, Brooks Brothers type, the cuff yet buttoned at the wrist, a parody of careful dress, preparedness. So you had not rolled up your sleeves yet this morning, when your suit jacket, here are the pants, dark gray with subtle stripe, as worn by men like you on ordinary days. And briefcase, you've none, reverse commuter, come from the pit, with nothing to carry but your life, were torn from you, as your life was not. Your face itself seemed to be walking, leading your body north, through the age of the face, blank and ashen, passing forth and away from me, was unclear. The sandy crown of hair, powdered white like your feet, but underneath not yet gray. 47? 48? The age of someone's father. And I trembled for your luck, for your broad, dusted back, half-shirted, walking away. I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive. Oh my God, in whom I don't believe.
I wanted to cry when I read this. I mean, this is like real resurrection in a sense.
Yeah.
This is better than the best photograph.
This was just
Nice. Yeah,
And
I
that's
think,
unusual, because often
Yeah.
words don't do it.
right. It's I think it's a really powerful poem.
yes.
And most of it is really straight imagery, right? There's so much imagery in it. And to the point that you can almost picture this, right? Here's a person who's speaking, who wasn't there, or who was near there, right? But is watching this person, as she says, come from the pit, right? With one sleeve torn away and the briefcase gone, covered with ash, looking so dazed.
Brooks Brothers is part of a poem.
Right, I know, and yet it
That's what it
works,
is.
right? And I think that we probably don't need to talk through all that imagery, although I encourage you to read it again because it's so beautiful. But the last part is really where we get to what's going on in the poem. What's the sort of larger message or takeaway that the speaker's offering us? Yeah.
Rain on the Parade here. I really didn't like this poem at all.
Oh, okay.
I felt it was really cheap, and I felt it was kind of show-offy and then very elaborate description. He liked it much better than I.
I
thought
love
this
this
is way
poem,
too
but
much
it's-
work. This is show me how smart you are. And then when we get to the very end, I thought that was really cheap, frankly. Every other poem I admired so much in the struggle and the thoughtfulness, and this was just sophomore, it seemed to me.
So interesting.
Yeah, I
Okay.
really was extremely turned off by the poem.
Huh, that is so
And-
interesting. Okay.
and it's
Most
funny
people
because-
don't have that reaction, but that's,
Yeah, no,
you
I
know.
had it very strongly, and maybe
Yeah.
because after, not 9/11, but the dress rehearsal for it, the first World Trade Center bombing, I was on a train and saw some people come in, particularly one woman whose coat had been shorn off her.
Yeah.
She had escaped, and so I had my own kind of little
Image of that,
experience
yeah.
of seeing somebody who
Right.
had escaped with their life.
Uh-huh.
So I should have been able to relate to this poem, and,
Yeah.
and I just found it extremely off-putting, but that's me.
Okay, no, well, look, here's what art does, right? That's what it does. It's polarizing. There's something lovely about reading something and everyone goes, oh. But there's also something really lovely about people reading the same thing and having different reactions to it. And it's important. When my students do that, sometimes I say, let's make sure we all understood it the same way first. Here I feel like that actually did happen. And once we've all understood it the same way, there's limits, but because we all bring to it whatever our own experiences and backgrounds and beliefs are. But we understood the language here, and then we say, I reacted to this in this way, and I reacted to it in that way. And I think that's great. Like, that's how it should be. I'm sorry you didn't like the poem, but, because obviously I want to try to introduce things that people like just because that's fun. Like, like it's sad when you tell someone to read a book and then they come back and say, I really hated that book. Like, you feel bad. But I think there's also something really valuable about hearing multiple perspectives. I teach this one a lot, and people almost always love it. So it's useful for me also to hear that you didn't. But can we talk about it as though it's worthwhile and not sophomoric, at least for a minute? Okay. Okay. So what's the theological perspective at the end? Yeah.
Well, in spite of everything, in spite of the image, in spite of the event, this person still can't get down and thank God entirely, I think.
Entirely, okay. But the entirely is important there.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, what did you want to say?
I think that it illustrates that this person may not have believed in God, but at that instant when she saw what happened, she did have a religious feeling and a religious belief.
That's definitely one possibility. So when it says, the God in whom I don't believe, it's saying, like, as a general rule, right? I think of myself as someone who doesn't believe. But in this moment, maybe yes. Right? So that it's not that there's a crack in the belief, as we were saying for some of the other poems, but a crack in the non-belief. Are there other ways to read it too?
Well, he says should. Should is sort of just like stands out there.
Right.
You say, oh my God, there, but for the grace of God go I, and I'm alive, and I see you alive.
Oh, well, it says I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, not that I'm alive, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
But there, I should have. And
Right,
does
but
mean
that means I
I
didn't. Exactly. Right. So what does that suggest then about the speaker's belief? I should have, but I didn't.
But it's ambivalent.
Yes.
It's ambivalent
Right.
because
Right.
it's very simply put, but even after 9/11, you heard, of course I heard stories about people who came late in their lives were saved, but then there were people who went to work early and died.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
So this poet is really expressing
It's every
very
tragedy.
simply the ambivalence of the situation.
Right.
And
That's right.
it's so stark. It's just laid out there so simply that it gives everybody a way to interpret it.
Interesting. Okay, good. Yeah, it is a simple poem. I agree. That may be why it felt sophomoric too. The language is much less complex than any of the other ones that I brought in.
But in a sense, she takes what a photograph, you can look at a photograph and look away, and she makes you keep looking at every nuance of this man.
Mm-hmm.
So that she makes you consider it for many, many lines and notice every subtle detail. So in that sense, she's really using the language, to stop from having a gestalt feeling about what happened that day and really take it down to a personal level.
That's true.
And I think
that's true. It's very individual here. It's one person looking at one other person.
Right.
I also just love, this reminded me of what you were saying about the previous poem, that it says, oh my God, because of course that's our throwaway phrase, right? But the way it says it here is, oh my God, in whom I don't believe. And when you say it like that, oh my God, I think you're saying you do believe, right? I mean,
Or
how
you're
else are you-
ambivalent. I hear
Right.
the same ambivalent.
But it can't be complete non-belief, or you
No.
wouldn't say, oh my God.
You're
Not in
doubting.
that way, right?
I'll buy it.
You what?
You're doubting. It's the agnostic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love that sort of pull, like that sort of trapped in the middle. Yeah.
At that moment, she's a human being and she has nothing else to turn to but God. In the sense, that's where she gets her belief from, to see this miracle sort of happen.
Maybe, although just 2 lines before that, she says, I trembled for your luck. Luck is a different thing.
Wait, I didn't see that.
So it's leaving open possibilities that luck is what's there, not belief. It's not clear, right? I think that's what we see the ambivalence, right? Did you want to say something?
Just one thing that this poem gives that I think is a little bit unusual in the reading is the sense that she's describing a vision that in some ways, even though it's real, has an aura of unreality about it. That this man is he's like an ember plucked from the fire.
That's right.
And even the images, some of the images, I know you didn't want to get too specific with this.
Oh, you can.
But in briefcase, you've none, reverse commuter from the pit with nothing to carry but your life.
That's a great line. The parentheses are used really well here also. Yeah.
But again, somebody had already said the idea of this like almost a figure out of resurrection.
That's right. Yeah.
Or almost like a prophetic
That's right.
vision.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I kind of, whether it's comes a little too easily or not, I'm not sure. I haven't really been reminded about it completely, but there is the sense here that she's been granted some kind of a vision that she's connecting to. So it's both about.
I like that idea of a prophetic vision in particular. There is something like an air of prophecy about it. That's supposed to lead to some kind of belief, and is it working?
She's been granted this. She's not sure exactly what to do with it.
That's a great point.
But you have the reality of this poor man who's, he doesn't pretty much not even know at that point that he would not be able to get back to Jersey.
Right, sure. Right, we know some stuff outside of what even these people would know in this moment. Yeah.
And her own experience, somebody who's been touched by the vision of him.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted you to see that one too. And now, look, I'm including her in the category of Christian poet, but unlike Jarman, that is not the preoccupation of most of her poetry. And this is, in a way, a historical poem that invokes God as opposed to a religious poem that happens to attach to a historical event. She's also an editor of poetry, so, for what that's worth. The one that I've just given you, I realized I forgot to write the poet's name on it. It's two-sided. This is Yehoshua November. November like the month, Yehoshua like Yehoshua. So it was very hard for me to choose a poem from him. So I really do encourage you to buy this collection. The collection is actually called Two Worlds Exist. This is the title poem of the collection. He has a second book that came out a couple of years ago that I also really like a lot. He, I don't know if any of you know Hillel Broder, who teaches here, but Hillel and Yehoshua November are friends with each other. They're both involved in a slam poetry circuit that I also used to be involved in a little bit. I was a judge for some of the contests, and Yehoshua November has been a judge. So he actually came here last year to read for our students and speak to them. And he read some of these poems before they had come out in the newest collection. But you can also look him up because there's some great interviews with him. And one of the things that's very interesting about him, and that sets him apart, he teaches at Rutgers and also at Touro, part-time at both, is he's Hasidic. And there are not so many, forget Orthodox poets, there aren't so many Orthodox poets. There are really very few English language Hasidic poets. And he does fascinating things to me with religious faith. And he actually has several poems that say, when I walk around in the world, people think of me as very religious, but I think of myself as like sort of a young, rebellious child. It's really interesting to hear how he's so self-reflective on his own sort of public image and how he looks to his students and things like that. So I really encourage you to read him, just as a Jewish poet who I think is offering something right now that pretty much no one else is offering. So I brought in this one just because I couldn't decide. So I thought we'll read this and talk about it. Yeah, that's okay.
Does he hold tshuva?
He was raised in a traditional family. I think that they were not Hasidic.
In a Hasidic?
I don't think so. But he was raised religious. I mean, in a traditionally observant family. I think not Hasidic. I think his father's an obstetrician. Not that would mean that he's not Hasidic, but I think not. I don't know the exact details of that, of when he became, I guess, more observant in that way. Definitely observant. Two worlds exist. If I wear an ice suit, I can fly beneath the sunset and not burn, my son said from the back of the van as we drove over the bridge beneath the pink sky. And if I wear an ice suit, I thought, perhaps I will finish my days without roasting in the oven of what one human does to another, or the furnace of what God does to man. Once in shul, I sat across from a rabbi who spoke of his suffering. He said, I don't have feet to stand on to complain, but I remember standing in a room 30 years ago, the Rebbe raising his voice to call God to task. A week earlier at the ritual bath, the rabbi realized he had forgotten his white Sabbath shirt. In the sanctuary, I watched him stand up to pray the silent prayer in his undershirt and long black coat. What role do these moments of minor embarrassment play in a life of greater miseries? Could the rabbi concentrate on his prayers? And if so, what did he ask God for at that moment? If I had worn a cage of ice around my heart, it would not have cracked as I stood in the Cheder narrow hallway and heard the principal's matter-of-fact voice say, concerning one of my children, we cannot help her. If I wear a band of silence around my head, I will hear nothing, what my youngest daughter hears. I would like to rise up and lodge a complaint before God, but each morning I wake late for prayers and rush to catch up with the other worshipers. Once my wife turned to me and asked, do you think this happened because God wanted to show us what innocence looks like? Isn't she happier than the others? Then she turned her face back to her closet and cried into her blouses. Two worlds exist, the higher hidden one and our earthly realm. Everything that occurs in this life flows down from the hidden world. That which appears good descends through an infinite series of contractions until it fits within the finite vessels of this world. That which appears tragic slides down unmitigated from the higher realm, a higher, unlimited good this world cannot hold. So the mystics explain suffering if all comes from above, from where no evil descends. Is this something one tells another who is suffering? This is something one does not speak, but tries to believe when life no longer seems possible. When I was younger, I believed the mystical teachings could erase sorrow. The mystical teachings do not erase sorrow. They say, here is your life. What will you do with it?
It's really strong.
Yeah. One thing that you could know biographically, if you wanted to, and he writes about this a number of times, is that he has a daughter who's deaf.
A daughter who's
Deaf.
Oh, that's what.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, I think you can pick it out here. It's subtle, but he writes in a number of the poems about the deafness. Yeah. It's, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, and there's an awful lot here to talk about, but I at least wanted to introduce it to you as another way to think about piety and faith and belief in contemporary poetry, since all of the ones we read today were contemporary writers. He's younger. The other two are probably in their 50s or so. He's, I don't know, like maybe 30. So we're dealing with something that's slightly different, but all writing today, all continuing to write. So I'll ask you, instead of shaping the conversation for the 5 minutes that we have, what do you notice here? What did you like something about this? Does something about it rub you the wrong way? One of the three parts that you'd like to discuss? Whatever you guys want. Yeah.
There's a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
You can
Yeah.
feel it very strongly. Obviously, that child has caused him a lot of pain, and his wife as well.
You mean his wife has caused him pain, or the
No,
child has
no,
caused his
the
wife pain?
child
Okay,
has
yeah.
caused his-
Well, the child
his
suffering.
crying.
I mean, and also that sort of that awful, we cannot help her, right? I mean, so it's not the child that's causing pain, but observing the child's suffering, or people saying that the child can't be helped.
And he makes an observation that mystical teachings do not erase the sorrow.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes we
Love
think
it.
the mystics are above it all,
Mhm.
and they get over the sorrow. But he says, it just tells you this is your life. You got to deal with it.
Right.
It's very interesting
Yeah.
because we don't think that way of mystical
Mm.
teachings. They're somehow esoteric and
Right.
they elevate you above
Right.
your physical condition.
Excellent. That's a great start to talk about this. And I would say that, in fact, I think he is saying that the mystical teachings elevate you and are esoteric and all of those things, but that the question they're asking is, what will you do with your life? And so that the teachings don't solve your problems, but pose the question back to you. But it doesn't mean that there's no answer. But ending this poem with a question, I think, is putting the question back to us and saying the mystical teachings can help us to reach that. Not that they're valueless, right? But that the value may be slightly different from what we anticipate the value to be. Another great line break I'll just point out, I believe the mystical teachings could erase sorrow, the mystical teachings. Do you see how he did that? Right, so that you don't know what's coming next, and then do not erase sorrow, to have undermined the last line. But I think that line break is very cleverly done. I'll just point that out as a side thing.
I'm
Yeah.
intrigued by the ice. The ice.
Why he starts with the image of the ice, yeah, the ice suit.
The ice is such a powerfully concrete,
Yeah.
I mean, it melts.
It also feels like a kind of thing his son might actually have
Yes,
said
no.
as like a launching point for
And
the
then he
poem.
pondered
Like, you
it
know how
for
kids just say
himself.
these random things out of nowhere, right? But then the way that he thinks about it, it's so jarring because I think you start the poem going, "Oh, that's like a cute little thing that a child said. That's sweet," right? And he takes it immediately to a very dark place. And so you have a juxtaposition of moods at the very opening too. And then in the second section of the poem, he brings the idea of ice back, but a cage of ice, yeah. And that's also in reference to his children.
My heart would have broken.
Yes, that's right.
Enclosing him.
That's right. And if he had that ice cage around his heart, he wouldn't feel the pain that he feels about his daughter in the
I
same
think
way.
that's what I was going to say,
Yeah.
that the ice protects you in a way. It hardens you in a way so that you don't feel your pain.
Right.
And also, though, that God actually, for all the good things that are given out, there are also tragic and sad things.
Yeah,
And
that's
yet,
right.
you know, you have to choose. Do you live with it? Do you continue to believe?
Right.
Well, he argues that our world is a narrow container, so even though only all good flows from heaven, sometimes the containers it's in limits it for us.
That's the mystical part in part 3. Yes,
Right,
that's
yeah.
right, exactly.
Just before we break,
Yeah.
when he's talking about the second and third paragraph, is that satire? Like the rabbi, he has
I think
to
that
garden-
probably actually happened, is my guess.
Right, but it's there because like this is what the rabbi is worried about, and here I have my deaf daughter.
Oh, I don't think so. No, I don't
I
think
don't
it's
think that's
mean-spirited
right.
like that or angry. I think he's just saying, here's this rabbi experiencing a minor embarrassment. He calls it a
Right.
minor
A minor
embarrassment,
embarrassment.
and saying, what do you say to God when you're standing there shirtless? Because it's time to daven the Shemona Esrei, and
You
so you're going to say
concentrate.
it.
You
And he's just, it's just asking a question. But I don't think that it's a hierarchy of suffering at all. I don't think it's oh, how can the rabbi be concerned? He doesn't even indicate the rabbi is concerned. The rabbi's just doing what he has to do. He happens to not have a shirt. But he wonders, what do you say to God in that moment? So I think it's very sort of open, accepting kind of mood, not preparing us for like, my thing is worse. And I don't think he'd even go there in this poem because he was just talking about, you know, the oven of what one human does to another. So in that hierarchy of suffering, I don't think he'd even, you know, he would put his daughter above that. So I don't think that it's that kind of list. I think it's all of these kinds of relationships to God in different moments. Yeah.
He's talking about, he's in a way talking about a hierarchy of suffering, I think.
Well, when he says, what role do these moments of minor embarrassment play in a life of greater miseries? Yes, but I don't think he's saying is,
This is one thing, the
Yeah.
rabbi, you know, has this minor embarrassment.
yeah.
You know, and yet, and also the next section,
Yeah.
where he talks about his wife's, you know, the pain that he shares with her, with her daughter, her trying to justify it.
Right.
Is this, is it what this sorrow that we have, is it actually in some way, is there an upside? Is there
That's right.
protection? Is she
Yeah.
innocent in some way?
Right.
Or is her child protected by this limitation?
Yes.
And then she cries into the closet with where her blouses are hanging, and again, oh, we live in this world where you have
Extra blouses.
extra.
It's
Yeah,
true.
that's-
It's right. A closet with extra
definitely,
blouses. That's right.
You know, so on one hand, you know.
Which connects back to the missing
this
shirt,
has-
right? It's true.
Yeah,
It's true.
this has, I mean, you know, definitely he's very much aware. This is a tremendous sorrow for them,
Yeah.
or tragedy, or whatever you want to look at it, and he contrasts it with the perfection of
Good.
of the other world,
Yes.
of the higher world,
That's right.
or whatever you want to call it.
Right. When he pulls out in that third section to say,
there's
there's a bigger thing here. There's a bigger picture.
And here, when the world where things are broken, and the break can be from like almost apocalyptic, you know,
Right.
suffering to the very, very real suffering
That's right.
of their experience with a handicapped daughter,
Right.
to, you know, maybe again some
Right.
you know, the minor embarrassment that an rabbi endures, and he still
Good.
goes ahead and prays.
Right. All right, we're gonna have to wrap it up, but
Can I just ask one quick
yes,
question?
sure.
In the
I don't know if I
second
can answer.
stanza and the third stanza, the rabbi is not
Paragraph.
the same rabbi.
No, oh, not the
These
same.
different rabbis? 'Cause
Yeah,
I found,
different.
I was very confused by that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. They are
Um,
different people.
They are different
I
rabbis.
think so
sat
because it's
across
the
from
ones
the
in shul I
rabbi.
sat across from a rabbi.
It's the same
Yeah.
rabbi.
He thinks it's the same, you think it's different.
Oh, interesting.
Well, it says the rabbi in the next
The second time,
paragraph.
so maybe it's referring to that same rabbi.
Yeah, I thought it was different.
Yeah, I thought so too.
I had read
By
it as different
generations.
also,
Yeah.
because I thought the rabbi just meant like my rabbi or like the rabbi of my shul, as
Yeah.
opposed to sitting across from a
also
guy
thought
who was
they
a
were
rabbi.
different
I don't know. I'm
But
not
in
sure.
his shul, we
how to
have,
change
we
it.
have tons of rabbis in his shul.
Right, exactly.
There'd be so many.
No, but I meant like the rabbi that he sees as his
The
rabbi.
fact that he says "we,"
Yeah, that's how I was reading
I
that.
think-
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Right.
you're referring back to the.
It could be. It
rabbi.
absolutely could be. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a good point. I hope this makes you want to read more of this guy's poetry. This is fantastic.
Maybe to really.
Yeah,
It got too much.
Oh, sorry.
No,
Okay.
no, right.
It has been such a pleasure
yeah.
having
Thank
you all
you.
here.
Thank
Thank you. I hope that there are multiple things to take away from this about different ways to read poetry, about the value of poetry, about not being scared to read poetry if you felt like you were maybe before, and also about the ways that as Jews we can read poetry from people of different traditions and still find so much value in it. So all of that, and if you ever want to reach me or ask for poetry reading suggestions, you can find my address, my email address at the school website, but it's gsteinberg@sarhighschool.org. So I'd be happy to be in touch. And thank you all so much for all your thoughtful participation. It's been really fun. Have a great day.
Thank you
May I
so
have
much.
another one of them?